Live from the Talking Joe Studios. It's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the G.I. Joe Comics podcast. Now, today we are doing something a little bit different. We're going to be bringing you a comprehensive comic book guide to the entirety of the publishing history of G.I. Joe Comics. So for new listeners and old alike, I'm sure we'll bring you all sorts of interesting tidbits of information to help you make sense of the G.I. Joe Comics publishing history. But I will not be doing that alone. As always, I will be joined by my co-host. It's a real American Tim. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners and viewers. Listeners, we will do our best to make this episode entertaining, but as we talk about issues and runs, Mark has put together a great slideshow with sort of number one issue covers, and in a few cases, final issue covers. So if you're listening and we're just sort of ogling something and you don't know what we're talking about, it might be a bunch of men and a woman jumping off a tank with a red sky and an explosion behind them, or something like that.
Right. So yeah, if you are normally just an audio only listener, you're welcome to come on over to the YouTube channel where the water is warm and have a little bit of visual flair. But if you're quite familiar with the G.I. Joe comics and got a good sense of some of those images in your brain box, then I'm sure you can follow along and not get too confused. So our ultimate guide to the G.I. Joe comics history begins in 1981. So we're talking about G.I. Joe, a real American hero, the modern 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joes here. So let's forget about not pay too much heed to everything that went on in the ancient 12-inch history and beyond. But so really, G.I. Joe as we know it began in 1981 as Hasbro were assembling the new 3 3/4 inch toys. They had a lineup of an initial 13 characters, and those characters were essentially military specialists, really. They had a laser guy, a bazooka guy, a commando, that guy will never come to anything, a mortar soldier, a machine gunner, and so on. And so they had some cool looking toys, but they didn't necessarily have an awful lot of story, which I guess is where Marvel came in. Tim, throw it to you.
I'll just take a quick half step back. We have mentioned characters and figures and men and women, and of course G.I. Joe is both an action figure and an action vehicle line. So at the same time in 81 that Hasbro was figuring out this lineup of characters, Hasbro was also figuring out a tank, a jeep, a missile launching thing. Yes, but Hasbro knows that it needs a story. Hasbro is competing against Kenner and its mega popular Star Wars toy line, which has these 2 movies and soon to be a third. But Hasbro doesn't have a TV show or a movie. How can Hasbro tell a story? Hasbro teams up with Marvel Comics to tell its story, and that's what we get as issue number 1. And while they're all figuring out issue number 1, they make a deal for an ongoing series for issue 2 and beyond.
Yeah, so that collaboration that Hasbro had with Marvel wasn't just a case of taking the toys and making a comic of it. The sort of the lead up to the publication of the comic in 1982 was a real collaboration around character and story and approach. So in the first meeting that Hasbro had with the Hasbro team and the Marvel team came together, they talked a lot about character, that it wasn't just going to be one guy called G.I. Joe. It's going to be a team, that there was going to need to be some bad guys that they were going to fight against. And what about Cobra? That sounds like a neat name. Let's do that. And it was sort of thrown over to Larry Hama to come up with a lot of the story and sort of the initial character creation. So they sort of moved on from just having very dry specialisms as their sort of placeholder name to actually having more exciting character names like Zap and Flash and Snake Eyes and so on. And as part of fleshing out these characters, Larry Hama wrote what he calls his dossiers or dossiers. And these were seen by Hasbro, and then a condensed version of these sort of character profiles saw fit as edited by Hasbro's Kurt Bazigian as the file cards on the back of the toys, which obviously became very iconic. So it all led to the creation of the comic book, and the comic book wasn't necessarily the end product in itself, because what Hasbro figured out was that they could run commercials for the comic book, which could allow them to do something that just running commercials for the toys could not. Tim?
It's not just Hasbro here. Let's introduce a third company, which is Hasbro's advertising agency, Griffin Bacall, which is named for the last names of the two principals. Joe Bacall comes up with this idea that if Hasbro runs a commercial that's 30 seconds of animation and it advertises not a toy, but a comic book, it can get around broadcast regulations. Whereas you were not allowed to have 30 seconds of animation or even 20 seconds of animation to advertise a toy, because that would be misleading, because kids would think that the toy could do all sorts of things that it can't do. Like it could fly, or it could, fire missiles or drive on its own. And so this is a workaround. And so the timing of March 1982 is this convergence of toy making between Hasbro and also factory in Asia, and Griffin Bacall, and also Marvel Comics, and also Griffin Bacall owned an animation studio, an animation production company, Sunbow. And so these four, although the people who worked at Sunbow were also the people who worked at Griffin Bacall. So there's this convergence of getting all these things out for March 1982, and then it's a big hit. And Marvel.
Yeah, let's have a look at the remind ourselves of what that commercial looked like while we're at it.
She's been kidnapped by Cobra. We have no alternative. Call in G.I. Joe.
Fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. He never gives up. He'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe.
Who's leader of the Joe team? Buck.
He's America's best. He's in control. He's the man.
Good luck, Joe.
He lives his days. The legend of G.I. Joe.
The Legend of G.I. Joe. New from Marvel Comics.
He's a man who's tough and bold.
Like you.
I hope so. I hope I am as tough and bold as G.I. Joe. All of them.
I think the like had never been before. Sort of a highly produced cartoon advertising ostensibly a comic ahead of its launch, which was going to be a key part of the success of the immediate success of the Marvel comic when it launched in 1982 with that iconic cover by Herb Trimpe, inked by Bob McLeod, seared into our brains by this point, Tim.
Yeah, I never get tired of looking at this, and I never get tired of seeing reprints of it. The dollar edition that IDW did, or the digest that Marvel did, or the oversized Treasury edition that Marvel licensed out, which Mark is holding right now. I've never owned that, although I have held it briefly in my hand twice. I think when I saw it, I think I might have seen it as a kid before I got into comics, and I thought it was a coloring book because I didn't really understand what comics.
So few that look like that.
Yeah.
So, G.I. Joe, Real American Hero from Marvel, ran from issue 1 in 1982 through to issue 155 in 1994 with the poignant story A Letter from Snake Eyes, which essentially wrapped up the run. But that was not all from Marvel during that era, because during that time, there was Special Missions, which ran for 28 issues, 1986 through to 1989.
These were all self-contained stories, single-issue stories, with one exception. Is it 14 and 15? That's a two-parter. And these were unrelated to the ongoing main book, with two exceptions. Is it issue 7, 6, and 26? Anyway,
The Outback story and the
October Guard story.
And the October Guard story, yeah.
If for some reason you loved G.I. Joe, but you didn't like Cobra and you wanted to read stories without Cobra, this was the book for you. It looked and felt like the main G.I. Joe because it was written by Larry Hama, of course, and also mostly drawn by Herb Trimpe, who had drawn the first 8 or so issues of the main book. Two more details. It launched with a special story that was a backup in issue 50 of the regular series. And it was, for 2/3 of its run, Special Missions was published every other month, bi-monthly. Then it went monthly.
Mm-hmm. But that was not all, because we also had 4 yearbooks, yearbook 1 through 4, which were published annually-ish, 1986 through to 1989. Then we also had another side book, G.I. Joe, The Order of Battle, which ran for 4 issues, 1986 through to 87. And these were a little bit different because they weren't stories. It was essentially character profiles. The first 2 books were the G.I. Joe characters. The third book was the Cobra characters. And each one had like a little mini dossier similar to what was on the file card on the back of the toys, and then a nice new piece of art with a full figure shot of sort of a hero shot of each one of the characters.
Just as we sometimes forget that G.I. Joe was not just an action figure line, but also an action vehicle line, issue 4 of Order of Battle had a drawing of every G.I. Joe vehicle.
Indeed. So that essentially is what we think of when we think of the A Real American Hero Hama-verse, because the bulk of this element of G.I. Joe was created by just one writer, Larry Hama, with an asterisk there for a couple of issues which were written by other writers, but we're talking vast majority of the run here. Running alongside that were a couple of instances where they were not written by Larry Hama. So in 1987, there was a 4-issue G.I. Joe and the Transformers series, which, while looking very familiar to G.I. Joe readers, because again, it was drawn by Herb Trimpe, it was written by a different writer, and the continuity of this particular title wasn't referenced back in the main book. Unlike actually Transformers, where the continuity of that particular title was more significant for the ongoing title. But Transformers did make a return, and when it returned in 1993 for a few issues, issues 138 through to 142, those were written by Larry Hama and so are considered part of that Hama-verse. And the actual events of that particular arc were fairly significant because we had a few characters brought back during that time. It makes for an interesting story. But then here's where it gets a little bit more confusing as well, because this particular arc then went on to be continued in the Transformers Generation 2 book, which ran for a brief while. Again, this title was not written by Larry Hama, and while it is a continuation of the story that he set up, he doesn't necessarily consider it part of his own continuity, given that he did not write it himself.
And G.I. Joe does appear for a few pages in this 12-issue run of Transformers Generation 2.
Exactly. Yes. So it definitely sort of is in continuation of that G.I. Joe story, but not necessarily part of what is considered the canon Hama-verse continuity, given that he did not write these issues and so does not consider it part of his canon. Also non-Hama was G.I. Joe was G.I. Joe European Missions, which ran for 15 issues. And we'll touch on that again in a little bit, so I won't labour it here. That was 1988 through to 89. And also during this time, we had a somewhat anomalous another publisher publishing G.I. Joe comic books. This was Blackthorne, and they released two series, G.I. Joe in 3D and How to Draw G.I. Joe. Tim.
Blackthorne was licensing properties like Robotech and Transformers and Moonwalker, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. And so, in the same way that nowadays we see G.I. Joe figures made by Hasbro and then slightly different and differently scaled G.I. Joe figures from other toy companies, Marvel's license didn't cover apparently How to Draw and 3D properties versions. So Blackthorne nabbed those. And one day you and I should read these G.I. Joe in 3D comics and talk about them on Talking Joe, Mark.
Indeed. Some highlights of this particular era to call out, and this is, everyone's going to have their own favorites, but I've tried to go for common ground here of well-loved consensus kind of views on favorite comics. So issue 21, the groundbreaking silent issue 26 and its companion 27, which is the Snake Eyes origin and the flashbacks to the long-range recon patrol in Vietnam. Issue number 34, this spectacular standalone story featuring Ace in the Sky Striker versus Wild Weasel in the Rattler, and yearbook number 2, which features a standalone story drawn by Michael Golden and is a favourite for many, and even warranted its own artist edition, which was released in a portfolio format with the sort of essentially reproducing the original black and white art boards, so that you could drool, admire over those particular boards. But there's many other favourites, and I think it's fair to say that particularly the first 50 issues, but I'd go so far as to say, most of the arc up to towards the end, where things begin to get a little bit looser. There's gems to be found, throughout the entirety of the arc, of the original 155 run and into the companion issues. Tim?
Yeah.
So at the end of each publisher, I was just going to sort of give a bit of an overview as to how you can get these issues. So obviously you can delve in the back issue bins and try and find the issues, because the publication runs were quite high. There was a lot of, and it was a very popular title, being advertised on TV as well, obviously. The back issues can be quite, they're not necessarily too challenging to find, and apart from some of the most significant issues like issue 21, are not necessarily going to be completely out of everyone's price range. Where it gets harder is in the last 10 or so issues of the run, where the print run was much lower, and it's those ones that tend to be the highest price. But there has been a number of reprints. So it was the entirety of the run was published by IDW, So Marvel did 5 trade paperbacks covering about the first 50 issues. Then IDW reprinted those and continued reprinting all the way through to the end of the Marvel run in 15 trade paperbacks. Then IDW also started reprinting in these nice hardcover editions, the Marvel run, and I think they only got through to volume 8 in those collections. Sorry, volume 9, I think. So they didn't see it all the way through to the end, unfortunately, which is kind of what let it down a little bit, because the completist, it feels like it's an unfinished project. But in recent years, it's suddenly much easier to collect the entirety of the Marvel run, because Skybound did a Kickstarter, which released these giant hardcover volumes covering the entirety of the Marvel run, and they are also releasing more mainstream trade softcover compendium editions of those. So I think we're up to volume 2 of that now, and they'll continue to go with those, producing through to the end of the run. And they'll, and try and be comprehensive as possible, but there's within this there's always nuance. So there's other reprint editions as well, and Skybound are beginning to reprint specific issues as well. So they've already reprinted issue 21, and they've just announced that they're going to reprint issue 26. Is there anything to add on that?
Interestingly, that IDW hardcover complete collection included in chronological order, not just G.I. Joe, but also special missions and the yearbooks, and then also later comics that Larry Hama wrote, stories that took place between issues, which we'll get to. Similarly, these 4 volumes of Skybound's compendia, both hardcover and softcover, include special missions and yearbooks woven throughout them in chronological story order, in publication order, I should say.
Okay, so while that was happening over in the United States, meanwhile, and elsewhere in the UK, there was some interesting G.I. Joe related publishing occurring, because IPC / Fleetway were also publishing some G.I. Joe related comics. So in 1983, they released a comic called Battle Action Force. So this was the long established battle war comic that was coming out weekly, and they partnered with the Action Force brand from Palitoy to weave into that anthology some Action Force related stories. So Action Force was the brand for Palitoy's toys, and they were developing these 3 3/4 inch figures as toys, while in parallel to Hasbro developing the G.I. Joe 3 3/4 inch toys. And because of their partnership, Palitoy were able to get hold of some of the molds to those toys and released some of the G.I. Joe vehicles in sort of the Palitoy branded colors. So you can see the Panther Jeep. There is a black Jeep, the recolored version of the G.I. Joe's Vamp, and they also used the recolored versions of the G.I. Joe figures as part of that initial line, and that was primarily to use them as vehicle drivers, so that they could have the articulation to be able to fit them nicely into the vehicles. So we saw a recolored Cobra Commander as the red laser, for example, or Scarlet recolored as the Ram Cycle driver, Quarrel. So those comics started coming out, and as the line progressed, the Palitoy moved away from just sort of producing, their own IP type characters, to re-releasing the G.I. Joe characters as toys. And as they sort of switched that dynamic, they started incorporating those into the comic. So the comic was very much focused on that wave of figures, led by Duke, with Stalker, Gung Ho, Blowtorch, Scarlet, and so on. And those adventures continued all the way through to the end of that particular book in 1987. And the first few stories from that era can be found in the Battle Action Force Treasury editions from Total Toys. So you can find 3 volumes of
Total Toy books.
Total Toy books. So these first 3 volumes, looking at that initial Red Shadow Action Force era, can be found and purchased. And of course, there's a website, Blood for the Baron, which also catalogues in great depth the toys and comics from that era. But when this book wrapped up in 1987, it was because of a sort of change in approach for Hasbro in terms of how they wanted to market Action Force, now that it had moved away from Palitoy into the more sort of Hasbro branded product. And so they did that with the launch of Action Force International Heroes, produced by Marvel UK in the United Kingdom, as it might suggest. And that was a weekly comic which ran for 50 issues, 1987 to 1988. So not too very long after that initial Battle Action Force comic had finished. It was resurrected as Action Force International Heroes with a largely new cast of characters. So Flint, Lady J were kind of the primary protagonists, with obviously Cobra Commander, Destro, the Dreadnoks, and so on. Essentially focusing in on the key characters / figures that were being released into the shops at that particular point in time. So it was very focused on the product on the shelves being marketed in comic form.
Mark, so the previous Battle Action Force Red Shadows material was all new and would look pretty unfamiliar to American readers. The Marvel UK Action Force comic, which ran for 50 issues, remind us, was that new material for the UK? Was that reprinted material from the Larry Hama Marvel? Oh, look at this slide.
So indeed, it was a mixture of brand new content, largely created by the Marvel UK office and stable of artists. So a lot of the up and coming UK comic artists of the time, and writers. So Simon Furman, Grant Morrison, Steve Yowell, Kev Hopgood, Mike Collins, and Jeff Senior. So a lot of the big up and coming UK comic creators creating brand new Action Force content specific for this comic, and then also giving space to reprints. So it essentially picked up the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero story, with the just before the Snake Eyes origin story arc. In fact, so it sort of picks up the story with that adventure that the G.I. Joes had in the Florida Everglades, meeting Zartan for the first time. And then from that point onwards, the continuity sort of was printed largely in chronological order. And there was even a couple of spaces for specials. So there was an Action Force holiday special with Snake Eyes alone, which reprinted that great Snake Eyes story, issue 31, where he was in his cabin under siege from Destro, Fred, and Firefly. One of my very favourite stories, which may have a tinge of nostalgia from reading it in this as that great holiday special, all in one go, unlike most of the other stories, which were sort of split up into a couple of bite-sized chunks across the weekly comic. So the other UK originated material was Action Force Monthly, which ran for 15 issues, 1988 to 1989. And if it looks familiar, it's because it was reprinted in the United States as European Missions. Essentially, exactly the same comic, but with a different cover, packaging the whole thing up. So the front cover had Action Force Monthly in the UK, a UK pounds price on it, and the G.I. Joe European Missions had that title. And also, I think the back cover and the advertisements on that were also different, but the actual material inside was exactly the same. And that was a mixture of mostly brand new content with a little bit of reprint of the Action Force Weekly material in there as well. So, for example, it reprinted the Action Force versus Transformer story that had ran in the pages of the Action Force Weekly comic. So that was it for the end of the Marvel era of G.I. Joe comics. But it was not the end of G.I. Joe comics. The first time that the license was next picked up was for Dark Horse, who were a successful publisher. And in 1995 through to 1996, they published two miniseries, G.I. Joe, which sort of subtitled G.I. Joe Extreme. It's got the banner running along the top of the book. Extreme Times call for Extreme Heroes. So 4 issues apiece across 2 volumes there. And this related to, I guess, the extreme relaunch of the G.I. Joe toy line, which was basically brand new and not really carrying on the Real American Hero toy, aspect in any form. So the figures themselves looked different. They were different characters, and the overall storyline was different as well. So while it was called G.I. Joe, it didn't really have much connection to what had come before. So it does tend to be a little bit forgotten about because it doesn't really necessarily fit in the overall continuity of G.I. Joe, American Hero, and the characters we love, which is why, as my graphics, I've got this kind of a little bit taped on because it doesn't quite fit. And it was a little bit of a slightly failed endeavor in terms of keeping that G.I. Joe comic brand alive.
We can go a step further, Mark. You said it doesn't really have anything to do with G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. It has no connection in the comics, and it has no connection in the toy. And you have to squint to find the connection in the animated series, which isn't even technically in the Extreme animated series. But the Extreme cartoon ran for 26 episodes. So, 8 comic books seems like a blip. But let me tell you, folks, in late 95 and all through 96, this was it for G.I. Joe. There was still some Sergeant Savage toys on shelves at toy stores and some A Real American Hero figures from 93 and 94. But in terms of new product, this was it. And Kenner, a part of Hasbro, was going all in on this. And then if I could do a small fact check, Mark, it does feel like it's 2 miniseries. In fact, it's 1 miniseries and an ongoing monthly that only lasted 4 issues. There was a 5th issue in the works, and in fact, the cover for that 5th issue was previewed, but it was canceled.
Yeah, and it was particularly disappointing for me at this period as well, because the G.I. Joe issue #1 has this incredible Frank Miller cover, which seems to promise so much, but it seems also entirely disconnected from anything else about the brand in terms of the level, the quality of art, the grittiness that maybe it suggests, and so on. So it's another piece of a disconnect of this particular relaunch for me.
Yeah, the Norm Brayfogle cover for issue 2 may also have been, had the Miller cover not happened, the Brayfogle cover would have been the cover for issue #1, and it's a more proper representation of the contents.
So after this Dark Horse attempt at continuing G.I. Joe in comics fizzled out in 1996, we didn't see G.I. Joe comic products on the shelves for a little while. The first aborted attempt to bring it back was in 1998, where Bench Press, a couple of creators, tried to bring back G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, with Larry Hama taking the writing helm, and they went as far as producing a mock cover and a few pages of art, which found their way out online. But ultimately, this didn't go anywhere beyond, I guess, some outlines as prepared by Hama and the few pages of art to kind of, I guess, see what we might have got. So Bench Press, a noble failure, but unfortunately, all we got from this era was a few pages sort of leaked onto the likes of yojo.com.
Bench Press Comics was already a very small but successful independent comics publisher, and taking on a license from Hasbro was going to be a giant leveling up from them. Bench Press had plans for multiple G.I. Joe and Transformers titles, and had sort of handshake deals with the talent that it was going to involve, like Larry Hama and Simon Furman writing a Transformers title, and Andrew Wildman drawing a Transformers title. I was on the early intranet and in the Transformers fan club, the Transmasters, at this time when this news leaked. And I remember sitting at my desk in college reading in a newsletter that Transformers was coming back, and then a little while later that G.I. Joe might be coming back. And I was so excited. And then pretty immediately there was the counter news that this wasn't happening after all. And oh man, was that very exciting and then very disappointing. I sometimes think about how things would have gone differently had Bench Press Comics made that deal and rolled out these series. If that company would have had the sort of production pipeline to sustain all of this material with all this talent, and did the market I sort of ask myself hypothetically, did the market in 1998 want G.I. Joe and Transformers to come back? Because we have found that when that question is asked just a few years later, the answer is yes. And we'll never quite know what the answer would have been in 98. But if it had happened in 98 and fizzled, the relaunch we did get in 2001 either would have fallen apart or not happened.
Mm-hmm. Because indeed in 2001 was the next full-fledged relaunch of G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero in comics from Devil's Due Productions, initially sort of published via Image. So this was the Image G.I. Joe era number 1, and that lasted for about the first 25 issues of G.I. Joe from Devil's Due before they spun out and self-published under the Devil's Due Productions banner themselves. So in 2001, essentially, G.I. Joe had been off the shelves for I guess like 6-7 years by this point. So I guess a lot of pent-up demands from people who are missing this comic book being available, and also coming on the back of some buzz from the likes of Wizard magazine, who were sort of beginning to sort of tap into that well of sort of nostalgia for some of these 1980s brands, and the people who had sort of grown up with them in the 80s were sort of now in young adulthood with their own cash money from from paying jobs to be spending grown up money on things like comics. So G.I. Joe issue number 1 launched sort of spearheaded by the the publisher of Devil's Due and writer of G.I. Joe issue #1, Josh Blaylock, who assembled a team of young talent to support him in this endeavor. And it ran through to 2008, and a Real American Hero continuation that they had, which started with issue #1, essentially picked up the same continuity that Larry Hama had established in his Marvel run, and sort of essentially the story was, let's pick it up a few years later and see where the characters are and go from there. And so there was two main runs of that particular book: G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, Volume 2, issue 1 through to 43, and G.I. Joe, America's Elite, which ran from an issue #0, relaunch, 25-cent book, through to issue number 36.
If I can jump in with a tiny fact check here, in the indicia, the Devil's Due G.I. Joe that ran for 43 issues is not called Volume 2, although we can all sort of casually refer to it as Volume 2, since it's the next comic that's just called G.I. Joe. It says A Real American Hero on the cover. I believe technically the title in the sort of publication fine print is G.I. Joe Comic Book. And then just to add a little detail to what you said, Mark, about picking up the Marvel Larry Hama continuity, indeed it does. Writer Josh Blaylock also sprinkled in a little bit of flavor from the 80s cartoon. But for anyone who'd been reading the Marvel run, who knew the Larry Hama material, this was absolutely what happened next from a different writer. Yeah,
and so it was a continuation of that same story from different creative teams, and running for an extended period. But when they got to the end of that run with issue 36 of America's Elite in 2008, and it was picked up later on, this storyline was not considered part of that official Hama continuity, and so it became what is known as the disavowed continuity, because it's like a timeline that has splintered off from the main sort of canonical Hama-verse timeline. So
just to phrase this another way, 98% of all the G.I. Joe comics that Devil's Due published don't, finger quotes, count in the greater Larry Hama continuity. You are certainly welcome, Devil's Due fans, to count the Marvel Larry Hama continuity and then the complete Devil's Due continuity as your preferred G.I. Joe continuity. Since Larry Hama has picked up from his Marvel run in later years, this Devil's Due material, 99% of it, does not count.
So a few highlights from this particular era. I've called out issue #1, which was just such a kind of delightful surprise that G.I. Joe was back. The package and the marketing of it was great. We had these great J. Scott Campbell covers on the front of the book, and this delightful painted art by David Michael Beck on the back of the books, and it was just a delight to see the story coming back. I've called out issue number 21, which was an all-silent issue, and this was drawn by Mike Zeck. So one of the few instances of Mike Zeck drawing G.I. Joe on the interior of a comic book, after being so well known as creating so many of the completely iconic covers. G.I. Joe, America's Elite, issue 0, I've called out. A great sort of relaunch of the title for that sort of the second half of the Devil's Due run of the title, and Stefano Caselli bringing sort of some real artistic heft to that book and making it look very different to what had come before. And he, subsequent to that, he was picked up as a very hot artist for going on to do work for Marvel. Sins of the Mother, which I think is issue 21 of America's Elite, was the first issue from the new creative team who sort of picked up with issue 21 and ran through to the last issue of the book. And again, sort of just a great new soft relaunch. The creative team there of Mark Powers on writing and Mike Baer on art. Just a really great team, and that last run of the book, running from Sins of the Mother through to World War III, is considered with a lot of fondness by fans. And then I've also called out G.I. Joe Declassified just to highlight that Hama wasn't completely forgotten about during this era, and he did do some work for Devil's Due, and some of that work is still considered part of his era continuity. So he had this title G.I. Joe Declassified, mini-series which sort of looked at the very early days of the G.I. Joe team as they were forming ahead of issue number 1, and giving a spotlight to a number of the sort of solo title characters within that book, and also introducing a brand new character who's sort of gone on to have a kind of new lease of life in recent times, which is Shooter, the G.I. Joe sniper, who was originally just a throwaway name on a monitor in the pages of G.I. Joe issue number 1. So there were many different titles that Devil's Due released, which are shown up on screen now. This is a little bit of a checklist as created by Greg Augustin of the After Action Report team. And I will call out the After Action Report guidebook produced by those guys who sort of really do have put together the definitive guide to this particular era. So if you want to delve into that era and make sure that you're collecting everything, that is a really useful tool to have for that. And of course, we at Talking Joe have really done a deep dive into this disavowed era from Devil's Due, and I've got lots and lots of content that you can delve into to explore the detail of many of these different titles. And we've covered almost all of it now. I think it's essentially G.I. Joe Reloaded era, and that's about it now. Storm Shadow still to come. Speaking of which, this is the Hama-verse, which hasn't been disavowed necessarily from the Devil's Due era. So what did Mr. Larry Hama produce during the Devil's Due era? So initially Frontline, which was a sort of spin-off series from the main one, and he wrote the first 4 issues. I've put a maybe part of his continuity because it doesn't necessarily directly conflict with anything else that he's done. You can kind of slot it in between issue 155 and issue 155 and a half when he picks it up, but he didn't especially enjoy the writing experience on that one, which was a bit more about sort of coming up with a plot for the entire series, as a guide first, and then delivering against it, rather than sort of his one page at a time approach. So when he talks about what he considers to be his continuity, he tends to leave that one out of his list. We talked about G.I. Joe Declassified with the introduction of Shooter. Storm Shadow was a mini-series which I think lasted, was it 7 issues, I believe?
Well, technically, it's not a miniseries. It was a monthly that was canceled. But
True.
now it looks like a miniseries in hindsight.
Yeah, and I believe that there was a trade paperback released of that, which had the first 6 issues, with then issue number 7 that was went uncollected. And he Hama has sort of referred back to some of the events of Storm Shadow in subsequent work. So for example, the character Pale Peony and Granny Demon were introduced in the pages of Storm Shadow, as were some of the named swords, sort of Morning Light, Evening Shade, that are referred to later on in A-Ra as well. He wrote a story called Silent Prelude, which is a prologue to issue number 21, which saw print in Snake Eye's declassified trade paperback and has never been reprinted anywhere since. So while we're talking about... Go on.
Did we spend a whole 45 minutes or a whole 2 hours
least.
talking just about Silent Prelude, which is like 6 pages?
I think we might have done that.
Yeah, I think we might have done that.
So all Devil's Due is the books from that area are relatively easy to come by unless you're trying to find very specific limited edition covers and so on. If you sort of looking in your comic book stores or on eBay, you can find a good chunk of these. Most of them did get reprinted into trade paperback collections of one sort or another, but have not been reprinted more recently post the Devil's Due production era.
Let me add a detail to that. Devil's Due reprinted everything that it published just about, and those tended to be slimmer paperbacks with 4 issues or 6 issues at a time. A few years later, when the next publisher, IDW, gets the G.I. Joe license, while it's reprinting all of the Marvel run in those 15 softcover volumes that Mark previously referred to, it also reprinted the main Devil's Due run, G.I. Joe and America's Elite, and that's where that disavowed tag was first used. So if you are if you're going online or you're looking at a store, or if someone says, "Hey, I've got Devil's Due Volume 2 trade paperback," double check if that is the Devil's Due version or the IDW reprinting of Devil's Due, because those are not always the same books and they don't all line up.
Mm-hmm. Good shout, Tim. So, in this period, towards the end of the Devil's Due era, there was also Hasbro producing some G.I. Joe comics as well, and these were essentially what we call the 25th anniversary toy comic packs. So during this time, they would release a 2-pack of figures in the sort of modern 4-inch scale, and alongside those figures would be a comic that ties in to featuring the same 2 characters as the leads. And so they released some reprints initially, and then they produced some new content. There was 3 issues which were sort of in between issues of the original ARA series. So issue 21B, so that was sort of running in parallel to the events of issue 21. Issue 32.5, so just after, well, in between 32 and 33, and issue 36.5, so in between issue 36 and 37, featuring the Tomax and Zaymot twins. And then subsequent to that, there was a number of other sort of more standalone issues, sort of, again, focusing in on the 2 main characters released in any specific pack. And for the most part, it feels like those are basically timeless stories, which are not necessarily tied into a particular continuity, and indeed may be at odds with the sort of what you might consider to be a real American hero continuity. So each one of those, I think you sort of take, squint at, think, does it fit into the Hama continuity or not? And then sort of enjoy it in its own right. Specifically, I'm thinking of like the Falcon versus Nemesis Enforcer storyline, which seems to be a little bit at odds with what we might expect from a Hama story, given that Cobra isn't really part of the ARA world.
These comic pack issues are easy to find. I see them all the time at G.I. Joe toy conventions, because I suspect that toy collectors have bought multiples of these toys back in 2008 and 2009, kept one sealed, opened one so they could display the action figures loose, didn't have much use for the comic, and have sold those off. We don't know what the production runs of these 2-pack action figures were. We know that the Devil's Due comics were not printed in as great a quantity as the Marvel comics of 2 decades earlier. The comics industry and sales were in a very different place in 2001 than they were in 1982. One or two exceptions for the ease of finding these Hasbro 2-pack 25th anniversary comics. The last one or two were, remind me, they were not actually released with toys, Mark, or they were just ultra hard to find.
Exactly. There's a handful, about 4 or so of the final issues in this, which weren't released in that 2-pack format. So they were either released as a kind of a store promotion, but buy the G.I. Joe movie, and you can eligible for getting a free comic. And there was one which was just only released as a digital comic, so it's not got any physical form to it. So those last few a little bit hard to find, just because of the slightly stranger way that they were distributed.
On screen, these first 3 that Mark referred to as in between or side issues, 21B, 32.5, 36.5, those have been reprinted in collections that we've already mentioned. The issues that come after on this current slide, issue 5, with Copperhead punching Shipwreck, issue 6, issue 7, these have not been reprinted. But again, you can find these online and at conventions.
Yeah.
And maybe your local comic book store. Your local comic book store was probably not ordering these in 2008 unless it was already carrying toys, new toys.
Yeah. And so there was also another publisher producing G.I. Joe comics in this sort of crossover period, running through to quite a bit later. So Fun Publications, FP, was producing comics running from 2008 through to 2017. And this was FP Fun Pub was the name for the G.I. Joe Collectors Club. So typically they would be producing a comic which tied in with the theme of their Collectors Club exclusive for the JoeCon of that particular year. And so the comic would typically feature whichever toy it was that was part of that set. So a nice tie-in, but generally, and they most of them also saw 2 versions. One which was released at the convention, and then a second version with an alternate cover being released through the standard comics publication kind of avenue through Diamond Distribution. So there are 2 of these, and they're not necessarily always particularly brilliantly labeled, so it's quite easy to not necessarily recognize which is which. But again, sort of if you sort of a Joe convention of some description, flicking through the long boxes, these do crop up.
Larry Hama was lightly involved with 1 or 2 of these, Mark. Did he do some dialogue over existing plot and art?
Yeah, as you say, I think potentially lightly involved in a couple of places, but for the most part, it's creators who are potentially less well known. Although you do see some creators that are more familiar, like Robert Atkins, who did do professional G.I. Joe work for the other publishers, who did produce some interior and cover art for these.
Many of these were plotted or written by members of Fun Publications, the top people of the G.I. Joe Collectors Club, who ran the G.I. Joe Collectors Convention. And I should add the word official, right? The official G.I. Joe Collectors Club and the official GI Joe Collectors Convention. When Mark and I have been referring to, Joe cons and conventions, we mean that sort of generally, but for this run of years, Hasbro licensed to a specific company run by Brian Savage in Texas, who had already run several. He had the GI Joe license first, and then he got the Transformers license for conventions and clubs, and made exclusive comics. So if you're looking through the credits, you might see a name that someone who was like a copywriter at Hasbro is contributing, or someone high up in the convention and collectors club sort of organizational structure. But you tend not to see comic book writers who from Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, or comic book artists. It's up and coming folks.
Cool. And then the next successor to the G.I. Joe comics crown after Devil's Due Publishing was IDW Publishing. So this was in 2008, and it ran through to 2022. And unlike the Marvel era, where there was a 6 or 7 year gap in between the end of the title and it starting again, in the case of the Devil's Due to IDW era, it was a case of just a few months. And Devil's Due lost the license because IDW had won it, rather than there being an independent idea to, cancel it, just stop doing it. So it was a slightly different dynamic, both in terms of why it moved from one publisher to another, and also the length of time that we had without G.I. Joe comics coming out monthly.
Let me add a small detail there. The Marvel run ends in 1994 because sales were too low and Marvel canceled the book, right? You may have heard, or you may have sort of put together through logic, oh, well, the toy was canceled, so they canceled the comic. I've asked around, and I firmly believe that Marvel canceled the comic on its own, and then also very soon after, or at the same time but independently, Hasbro ended the toy. So in this case, what Mark is saying is that Devil's Due didn't stop making G.I. Joe comics because sales were so low they had to cancel them. Devil's Due stopped making G.I. Joe comics because Hasbro did not renew its license and awarded its license to a rival company.
And part of the story about why the gap was so small is because Devil's Due were producing this 12 issue maxi series of World War III storyline, which was running through the last 12 issues of their America's Elite book. And they had kind of got the sign off, the go ahead from Hasbro that they could do that. And so they were given sort of special dispensation to keep on publishing slightly longer than perhaps they would have done otherwise, had it not been for this agreement to keep on going with the book, because of the commitment to do this 12 part final run.
We've mentioned Transformers once or twice. Transformers, as a sister Hasbro brand, and in comics, is always running some version of parallel. So at the same time that Devil's Due was making G.I. Joe comics, another publisher, Dreamwave, was making Transformers comics. Dreamwave fell apart, and Hasbro wanted to find a stable and high quality partner to make Transformers comics after that. And Hasbro found that in IDW. So when it was clear that, this is now from a fan perspective, when it was clear that Devil's Due would not be continuing G.I. Joe after World War III, right? All the other stuff starts to wrap up, Storm Shadow ends and there aren't any more one-shots or miniseries announced. A lot of people were guessing that Hasbro, already satisfied with IDW doing a great job with Transformers comics, would move G.I. Joe there as well. And it did. And
also worth noting as well, that Dreamwave did publish during that Devil's Due era a couple of G.I. Joe related books. So they produced the entirety of one Transformers versus G.I. Joe miniseries, which sort of took place in World War II, I want to say, with
So it's so good and weird.
with this amazing art by Jay Lee, and then a second G.I. Joe versus Transformers miniseries subtitled Divided Front, which only had one issue produced, but solicits were made for future issues. So I think more content was produced, but just never saw the light of day in terms of it being published due to kind of that implosion at Dreamwave. But yeah, in terms of comprehensiveness, there is another sidestep to during the Devil's Due era across to Dreamwave publishing those versus Transformers books. But back in 2008, when IDW got the G.I. Joe license, they did a big launch with an issue number 0, and that introduced that had 3 6-page stories from upcoming G.I. Joe comic series, G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe Origins, and G.I. Joe Cobra.
Which was technically just called... was it technically just called Cobra? I feel like in the Indicia it was just called Cobra. I don't have a copy next to me. Anyway, sorry. Please continue.
The front cover's got a G.I. Joe logo on issue number 1.
That's true.
So G.I. Joe, what I'm calling here season 1, ran for 27 issues. And look at that front cover for issue number 1 from Dave Johnson. Isn't that great? Then there was, in parallel, the Cobra book, which ran for 4 issues. It had a special, in fact, had 2 specials, and then ran for a further 13 issues. It was initially branded as as Cobra 2, being the sequel, but then that 2 element was dropped quietly, and it sort of was. I think it shifted from being a mini-series to being an ongoing series.
So if I can just jump in here, if you're holding a comic book that says Cobra issue 5, that takes place after the 4-issue Cobra miniseries and the special, after Cobra 2, issues 1 through 4, and the second special, then it sort of reverts back to Cobra Volume 1, because there hadn't ever been a Cobra issue 5. It's very confusing. We're so sorry.
And that Cobra storyline, very sort of highly thought of, and the main sort of Chuckle storyline that is referenced there, collected in this lovely hardcover, which is now quite hard to find, subtitled "The Last Laugh," brought to us by Mike Costa, Christos Gage, and Antonio Fuso. Then the third series spinning out of that issue number 0 launch was G.I. Joe Origins, which ran for 23 issues, and started out focusing in on the origin story of G.I. Joe in this new IDW universe. In the first arc written by Larry Hama, who wrote 2 arcs plus one one-off story. And then other writers and artists sort of alternated between the arcs, and the initial focus was on trying to tell origin stories of particular characters in this new universe, but then the lens sort of slightly shifted to focusing just more on telling stories sort of running parallel to the main title. There was also during this phase a spin-off mini-series, Hearts and Minds, which was a sort of written by Max Brooks with art by Howard Chaykin and Antonio Fuso, and it was 2 stories per issue, largely kind of one and done for each issue. And again, there was a nice hardcover produced which collected those 5 issues. So this IDW Chuck Dixon verse continued on and this next phase was 2011 through to 2013. So there was G.I. Joe Season 2, which ran from issue 1 through to issue 27, Cobra, which ran from issue 1 to issue 27, and Snake Eyes, which ran from issue 1 to issue 27. And so all of these titles were essentially relaunched with a brand new issue 1 to mark the Cobra Civil War. And so there was a lot of crossover sort of running between the storylines during that time. Subsequent to that, in the middle of this arc, was a story called Cobra Command, which was a single story which ran. Can
I jump in here?
Go on.
So what Mark's saying is the way to read Cobra Civil War, if you were reading just one of these three titles, if you were just reading Cobra or you were just reading Snake Eyes, you could read those 6 issues from Cobra Civil War in that one title without reading the other 2 titles. It was not a traditional crossover where you read, Amazing Spider-Man this week, and then chapter 2 is in Spectacular Spider-Man next week. This was 3 stories that ran concurrently for 6 months, and that told the larger Cobra Civil War story. When it was over, it was immediately followed by Cobra Command, which was a traditional crossover, which was, I forget, 9 or 12 chapters. And it was chapter 1 in one of the comics, chapter 2 in the next title, chapter 3 in the next one. And that one was just about all drawn by one guy. So that not only was one big story, but had a lot of artistic, what's the word? When something's very
coherence.
Coherence, yeah. And Chuck Dixon, calling this the Chuck Dixon verse, I don't think I invented that term, but I think I have been one of the people to help promote it. This all really is the IDW verse, but because Chuck Dixon wrote the main title in quote season 1 and wrote so much of season 2 and so much of season 3, the majority of it is his, even if it's only a slight majority. It may be more than 51%, but that's why we call it this. And another reason to call it that is if you see a G.I. Joe story, a comic book, and on the front cover, the first credit is Dixon, even if you don't quite know where in this publishing range it falls, you know immediately that it is not a Marvel G.I. Joe story. It is not a Devil's Due G.I. Joe story. You know it is not a Skybound G.I. Joe story.
And then the next phase of this IDW universe continues with G.I. Joe Season 3, this time not written by Chuck Dixon, but Fred Van Lent, with Steve Kurth coming back to the title, an artist who was previously at the very beginning of the Devil's Due era. Cobra is now called the Cobra Files, which ran for 9 issues. G.I. Joe ran for 15 issues. G.I. Joe Special Missions ran for 14 issues. This one was written by Dixon. And then Snake Eyes, Agent of Cobra, which ran for 5 issues. And this is... that felt very much like the culmination of a lot of the IDW universe at that point in time, because it was bringing together a lot of what Chuck Dixon had established, but also what Mike Costa had established in the Cobra books.
Let me jump back.
And then this was followed.
Before you get to season 4, this Chuck Dixon Special Missions run, which is made up of 3 arcs, when I was reading it, I sort of squinted and turned my head sideways and thought I could almost slot this in somewhere in the Marvel continuity. It's not the Marvel continuity. And then just one more comment about when the title Cobra becomes the Cobra Files, a main character in the previous sort of 2 seasons of Cobra, their arc wraps up, but another character sort of takes over. And that book that Mark held up, G.I. Joe Cobra: The Last Laugh, that is a great story. And if you like G.I. Joe, you should definitely read it. It's where G.I. Joe feels most like the TV series 24. It is worth reading all of Cobra and the Cobra Files, because some threads continue, and it's all still written by Mike Costa, and it's all drawn by, the whole thing together is drawn by two artists. And so there's a lot of internal consistency, even though that sort of initial Chuckles arc is sort of the first half or 2/3 of it. So thumbs up for me for reading all of Cobra, even to the end of the Cobra Files.
And then G.I. Joe Season 4, which is referred to as The Fall of G.I. Joe, which ran for 8 issues. It carried on with the artist from the previous run, which was Steve Kurth, but with a definite change in terms of visual approach. Season 3 was very much G.I. Joe as superheroes, whereas Season 4 was very much more grounded military espionage feel, and written by Karen Travis, who was a bit of an exception in terms of G.I. Joe writers, in terms of she was a Brit and also a woman. I think the first lady to write G.I. Joe. And yeah, as I say, a much more grounded espionage feel to the story, which is very, it's sort of, it continues on with some of the threads established in the continuity, so it's definitely part of that world, but also feels very much a kind of a part to itself.
Yeah, she was offered or promised, I think it's 10 or 12 issues, but sales weren't great, and so IDW contracted the run, and so I think she was disappointed by what she was able to do, because she wasn't able to tell the story she wanted to, the way she wanted to. I have read this run. It's good. I've read every single IDW G.I. Joe comic in any of the previous IDW slides that Mark has put on screen. And it was an interesting experience that every year or two, there would be these soft relaunches where the titles would all start over at issue number 1, all of the titles, and some of them would get title changes, and some of them would get slight focus changes, and in some cases, creative team changes. It felt very much like what was happening and had been happening over at Marvel and DC with, Batman and X-Men and Avengers and Spider-Man, where every 2 years or so, a long-running title ends, starts over at issue number 1, and there's a creative shakeup. Sometimes that's because there's a movie coming out and people are going to be much more excited to read a new Amazing Spider-Man number 1 the month that a Spider-Man movie comes out than, issue 24 from the previous run, or issue 713 if we're counting all the way back to the 60s. At the same time, by the time we get to season 3, it's starting to get confusing. If you're getting into it then, where do you go back? Which volume 1 do you read? If you have, a limited budget and there's 3 monthlies plus a side miniseries, which is the quote important one? If they keep relaunching these series every year or two, does it start to feel like they, IDW, the publisher, or us, the readers, don't have confidence in it? And, every time you do a new number 1, at a certain point, does it start to look desperate? Not like a bold new direction, because people who are interested in G.I. Joe probably read the Marvel run, and that didn't start over, at issue 50 after the fall of Springfield in 1986. It didn't start over at issue number 1 the next month. That was still Larry Hama, but now there's a different artist. It just kept chugging along. When the Transformers showed up, it didn't start over at number 1. When the Transformers left, it didn't start over at number 1. And so one of my habits when I go to comic book stores, after I look for dollar bins, I will see what their G.I. Joe back issue selection is. And sometimes if I see a bunch of the IDW stuff out of order, and there are tabs, I will fix it. Like, oh no, Cobra number 5 comes after Cobra Volume 2, number 4. Oh, well, they got the special, they got the Cobra special in the back under miscellaneous. Well, it kind of wants to be under Cobra. I don't know if they're gonna like me doing this.
Yes, and sort of to very much summarize and echo that, I think it's fair to say that the reading order for A Real American Hero of issue 1 through to issue 155 in the Marvel era, much more simple than trying to follow along with the IDW reading order, which only really gets more complicated as we progress to the next phase of the IDW continuity, which is what we call the Hasbro-verse, which technically continues the previous continuity, but definitely doesn't feel like it. It's so there's, I guess, a decision made to establish a combined Hasbro universe with G.I. Joe, Transformers, ROM, Mask, My Little Pony.
No. We can do this. Action Man.
Action Man, Micronauts.
Yeah.
So, and actually Action Force as well in there as well. So there's...
let me jump in. So a Transformers editor and writer were talking, and one of them realized that except for the fact that the Joes had never mentioned alien robots running around, and except for the fact that the alien robots in the Alien Robot books had never bumped into G.I. Joe by now and might have, you actually could, with all the previous Transformers comics published at IDW and all the previous G.I. Joe comics published at IDW, you actually could say that they'd always been in the same universe for the last couple of years and start to tell new stories. And there was interest in doing this. So they did. And so IDW expanded its license and wasn't just paying Hasbro for the privilege to make G.I. Joe and Transformers stories, but these other brands as well. And all right, so I hand the mic back to you, Mark.
So essentially they had a number of events to kind of bring these universes together and to tell these combined stories, which was Revolution, the Fallout Revolutionaries, and the First Strike event, which then told these bigger stories, and each one of the properties were having their own tie-in books alongside it, but very much trying to tell a combined universe story where in each issue there would be multiple characters from across these multiple properties all interacting. And for me, it's not my favorite era, and it gets very confusing. So I've largely sort of written this out of my mind in terms of just the memory of exactly what happens in these issues. And then at the end of the crossovers, G.I. Joe gets relaunched again with a 9-issue series, which for then some strange reason they relaunch as the much more powerfully branded title Scarlet's Strike Force, which ran for just 3 issues before cancellation. I think it was technically cancelled before issue 1 had even been released. So these the G.I. Joe relaunch and Scarlet Strike Force, these issues were written by Aubrey Citizen, who had previously written the G.I. Joe versus Street Fighter book. And it's very much his own take on the G.I. Joe property. It doesn't feel connected to the Dixon-verse and what had come before. It's leaning a lot more into bombastic action and the wackier elements of the G.I. Joe brand, the sort of the crazier characters and concepts that had not really necessarily been explored so much in the comics beforehand.
I was reading all of these as they came out, so it was easy to follow because every week or two there was a new G.I. Joe Transformers event or tie-in comic. The Transformers books up until this point were amazing and continued to be great during this final stretch at IDW. Part of why I liked Revolution that miniseries so much, and its follow-up Revolutionaries, and then its follow-up First Strike, is because IDW, rightly or wrongly, was now playing Marvel's game, right? If you read Civil War and then Secret Invasion, and then Dark Reign isn't a miniseries, it's an umbrella, right? And then Siege, which is a miniseries, Marvel had perfected, starting in 2005 or so, Marvel would have a big event miniseries, and a bunch of titles would come along for the ride. And when the miniseries ended, the story was over, but it was really setting up either the next sort of era or the next miniseries, the next event. And you'd want to read that to sort of know what was going to happen, and so that you'd understand it when you got to the next big event, right? And I mean, the final scene in Secret Invasion sets up Dark Reign, because someone kills a bad guy in a surprising way, and it's a surprising person, and the whole status quo changes. So Revolution was an event miniseries, right, where all of a sudden these other Hasbro properties show up. They've always been there. The Joes and Transformers meet each other. They've always been together, not together, but around. And then Revolutionaries is the monthly, which bridges the end of Revolution and the start of First Strike. And Revolutionaries is this team made up of one ROM, one Mask, one Transformer, one Joe, one Action Man, it's Action Man, and ends up getting really deep into the sort of Hasbro continuity of toys and characters that had been in G.I. Joe but hadn't sort of been in the Larry Hama story. And then when Revolutionaries wraps up, there's another event miniseries, but the focus is a little bit smaller now. Whereas Revolution was all these brands together. First Strike is really just a G.I. Joe and Transformers miniseries, right? The Joes plus Matt Tracker go to Cybertron. One other thing that I really like about this era is IDW was getting bold and experimental. That's the wrong word. Bold with some of its artistic choices, right? So look at these covers for Revolution and Revolutionaries. These are covers by Trad Moore, who drew really cool, weird covers, but it's also really hard to draw giant robots, regular humans, and then also Micronauts all on the same scale. And, Fico Ossio, who drew the interiors of this miniseries, Revolution, Trad Moore, who did the covers, they pulled it off. First Strike has covers by Freddie Williams II, and that's the first time we'd seen him draw G.I. Joe characters. Now it seems sort of old hat. The interiors on this Aubrey Sitterson G.I. Joe monthly, which runs 9 issues, Mark doesn't have it labeled here as season 5 or volume 5, but in the IDW publishing, that is what it is. It's season 5. It's volume 5. And I'm fond of Scarlet's Strike Force and this G.I. Joe run, because this is the first time you have some Joes running around with a Transformer on the team, which is now happening at Skybound in some modern day year 2025 comics.
Yes, and we could talk about the different approach that Skybound have taken to creating a combined universe versus IDW, but that would be a whole other long discussion, I think. So best to just skip ahead and talk about some of the other things that IDW published as part of their tenure with the G.I. Joe license. So they started off with the movie continuity. So the Rise of Cobra movie adaptation, Snake Eyes, Operation Hiss, a Retaliation prologue, I think, as well in there. But I think both Hasbro and IDW were expecting the movie to be a bigger thing and to play in that space more. But ultimately, I guess the movie wasn't the critical or commercial success that they hoped, and additionally. That meant that then the comics were less, I guess, sought after in terms of establishing that as a bigger continuity. then there were lots of sort of other sort of standalone things. So sort of alternative universes like Future Noir from 2010, crossovers like Danger Girl versus G.I. Joe 1 to 4 from 2013, which was done by John Royal, who went on to do lots of G.I. Joe covers for A Real American Hero. Transformers versus G.I. Joe, which was a maxi series 1 through 13 with a special as well. That one did also see print as a very nice hardcover edition, collecting it all into one book. Again,
Wait, does the hardcover have that special at the end?
Yeah, it does.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Okay,
so it is complete, but it does. That's called the quintessential collection. But again, quite difficult to find these days, unfortunately. Versus G.I. Joe versus Street Fighter 1 to 6 from 2016, which was also collected. Versus G.I. Joe versus $6 Million Man 1 through 4 from 2018, which is most notable for featuring art by S.L. Gallant. So he took on this project as a break from doing his long run on the main title, and then saw sort of an extended absence when that was done. World on Fire, which was a 10-issue series. I think it was intended to be an ongoing, but ultimately only saw the 10 issues from 2019. So World on Fire is quite accessible. That particular run from Paul Allor and Chris Evenhouse. So yeah, again, collected in a nice big accessible trade paperback. Sierra Muerte, issues 1 through 3 from 2019, which was, I guess, part of this phase where IDW were exploring different takes on their the G.I. Joe property from sort of, different esoteric creators. So Tom Scioli for Transformers versus G.I. Joe, and Michelle Fife doing Sierra Muerte.
Writer artists, I think that's an important detail. It wasn't just like interesting creators. It's that Transformers versus G.I. Joe, Sierra Muerte, and this next one by Rob Liefeld.
Beloved indie creator Rob Liefeld, who produced Snake Eyes Dead Game in 2020.
You should all definitely, as soon as you're listening to this or watching this, as soon as you're done, you should hop over to my blog, arealamericanbook.com, do a search for the word Liefeld, or just Google A Real American Book, Liefeld, and read my very long but profusely illustrated review of Dead Game, which I call a miracle. And then what's the last bullet point on this one?
The last one is Saturday Morning Adventures from 2022, a miniseries written by Eric Burnham, illustrated by Dan Schoening, which is essentially taking the very much the aesthetic and storytelling feel of the G.I. Joe animated Sunbow cartoon and sort of transferring it for a new story in comic book form.
Folks, if you are new to Talking Joe, we did an episode where we interviewed writer, artist, color artist, and creative consultant all at once on this Saturday Morning Adventures miniseries while it was being published. We did an episode, Mark and I. So if you have not delved into past episodes, I know you want to hear and see us talk about the new stuff, talk about this month's issue of G.I. Joe, talk about last month's issue of G.I. Joe. I don't want the old stuff, but our interviews are pretty timeless and pretty great.
Good. Speaking of pretty great, here are a few highlights of the IDW era, 2008 through to 2022. For me, at any rate, the ones I would pick out on my short list would be G.I. Joe Cobra, that's Chuckles' Last Laugh storyline, Transformers versus G.I. Joe by Tom Scioli, which is just nuts. is like something like nothing else you'll ever read, I think. G.I. Joe World on Fire, which it's sort of set in a sort of different, parallel world to the one we know where Cobra has won, and G.I. Joe is sort of like a bit more of a ragtag rebellion. So it's an interesting, different take on the G.I. Joe concept. And then the Saturday Morning Adventures take, which was just delightful, sort of a really fun kind of really tapping into all of the nice nostalgic feels of the animated show.
But not just that it sort of looked right and felt right. It's a good story. It's a fun comic, and I know that the creative team at Skybound doesn't follow this podcast, but man, and I know that the Saturday Morning Adventures tag belongs to IDW. They're continuing to publish their Ninja Turtles Saturday Morning Adventures monthly. That looks like the 1988 cartoon for Turtles, but man, Skybound should definitely do another miniseries that looks and feels just like the 80s G.I. Joe cartoon. And I would go as far as saying, by this same creative team.
They could go out there and just come up with their own sort of, really clever branding, like after school cartoons or something else.
Yeah.
So burying the lead here, IDW did not just do their own continuities. Very excitingly, they're in 2010, a couple of years into their time of owning the G.I. Joe license, they had the spectacular idea of bringing back G.I. Joe, a real American hero, with the original writer, Larry Hama, and continuing the same story with the same numbering with 155 and a half as a free comic book day launch title to launch into a new monthly title by Larry Hama, continuing on that same A Real American Hero continuity.
If half issues, if decimal point issues are confusing, right after G.I. Joe 155 and a half came G.I. Joe 156, right? Which is a regular full-size comic. And the only way to get 155 and a half was to go to your local comic book store on Free Comic Book Day, or maybe the next week if they still had copies and were still giving them out.
Or pick it up in a reprinted edition. So IDW were pretty good at reprinting the Real American Hero issues as they came out in sort of bite-sized chunks. So the first trade paperback of this would have included 155 and a half as the initial story in the first IDW trade paperback, which they would have numbered as volume 16, continuing on from the Marvel reprints, which was volume 15. But then,
wait, let me
doing a go on.
But you have to add the word classic.
Mm-hmm.
The IDW collecting the 155 Marvel issues is in classic G.I. Joe volumes 1 through 15, which each have about 10 issues. IDW took the first. IDW was doing this continuation 6 issues at a time, 5 issues at a time, as just G.I. Joe Real American Hero, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. And then I think, Mark, do you have the order mixed up? I feel like they did that first, and then they did bigger chunks of issues. And
oh, you're right. You are right. I got the order mixed up.
Classic Volume 16, which had 155 and a half, and then like 10 more issues. And that went on for a while, but did not make it to the end.
So to clarify here, so they initially published volume 1, which was issues 155 and a half through to 160. And that was in 2011, so just shortly after the issue came out. And then they also republished those same issues with the classic G.I. Joe tagline in slightly bigger chunks. So that was 155 and a half through to 165. So that was continuing that established kind of approach
reprint numbering.
Yeah, that Devil's Due had first introduced, where they had divided them up into 10-issue chunks for their publishing. And if you want to know more about the IDW Hama-verse publishing order, After Action Report Volume 3 is the guide that you need, which focuses in on all of the all of that era, the cover variants and how to collect it.
We should call out some names. After Action Report, lots of great indexing and organizing by Josh Eggebeen, Roger Taft, and Greg Augustin.
Very good. So this era of Real American Hero ran from 2010, when 155 and a half came out, through to 2022 to issue 300. So essentially, pretty much with a little bit of rounding, doubling that original run of 155 issues, wrapping up in 2022, with a little bit of synchronicity here of how IDW first got their license, with unfortunately for them losing the license to another publisher. And so that 155 and a half through to 300 was a continuation of the Hama-verse that had been established in Marvel. So we had 155 and a half, 1 through to 155 under Marvel. Then the Devil's Due era, which continued that same story, but has since been disavowed, apart from the cutout of the sacred timeline. Apart from those issues that we'd called out earlier, and then is picked up again with 155 and a half through to 300. But alongside that, also published by IDW with a few other extras, there was the 2012 annual and 2019 yearbook. The Silent Option mini-series, which was published sort of in parallel to A Real American Hero, and very much sort of intertwining in terms of introducing new characters and so on. Cobra World Order Prelude, which is essentially issue 218 and a half, so it just slots nicely in between 218 and 2119, and sort of is there as a kind of just to tee up readers, get them acquainted with all of the latest events of ARA ahead of the Cobra World Order story starting in 219. But unfortunately, just because it doesn't call out the numbering on it, it's easy to forget about or not collect quite so easily.
Let me say that in a different way. Mark just said the Cobra World Order Prelude doesn't call out the numbering. What he means is it does not have an issue number. It is just a comic book called G.I. Joe Cobra World Order Prelude. And you could skip it. I don't think it progresses the story much, but a character gives another character a tour of the pit and tells that character and us, the reader, the status quo of all the sort of factions of G.I. Joe at that moment. So it's a fun Larry Hama comic. And as Mark just said, assuming that some lapsed readers would come back for the Cobra World Order story arc, it was a way to refresh them. And man, I wish it had an issue number on the cover. Even more confusingly, the cover, the standard cover, has Snake Eyes having just taken down a Cobra Hiss. I don't think Snake Eyes is in the issue, and Cobra Hisses aren't in the issue. And it's a very striking cover with sort of no background. It's just Snake Eyes and a hiss with a white background. So, and then I think Cobra World Order Prelude is on the bottom of the cover. So if you're, maybe it's on the top. Anyway, if you just see this image, it doesn't immediately jump out. If you see a Mike Zeck G.I. Joe comic, a cover, you sort of know when it's from. That's from 84 to 87, right? You see this Paul Pope drawing of Snake Eyes, and there's no context clue except for the Cobra World Order Prelude logo. Okay, and then Mark, you've got one more bullet point on the slide.
And then I've also called out Origins issue 19, which is a kind of retrospective movement of continuity. So this was originally published in the Origins series, which was part of that Chuck Dixon verse we were referring to. And it's been sort of moved into the Hama-verse now, because it is being referred to in issue 321, which is essentially a sequel to this Origins story, which features these two bad guys that have been introduced with sound weapons, who show up again all of these years later. And we have done a brand new episode specifically looking at Origins issue 19 just very recently. So if you want to find out what we thought of that issue and how it ties into the Hama-verse, you can find out in great detail there. So the Hama-verse 2010 through to 2022, a Real American Hero. I think it's fair to say that it gets a little bit of flack from people saying that they don't like it as much as the Marvel era. And I think it does suffer a little bit from maybe a slight lack of focus and some reoccurring elements which I think aren't necessarily fan favorites or people sort of had a bit too much of. There's quite a lot of blue ninjas, and there's quite a lot of brainwave scanner stuff. There's a storyline called, spoilers, Death of Snake Eyes, which changed the dynamics in ways that people weren't necessarily big fans of. So, I think the general fan point of view is that maybe this era is a little bit less beloved than the Marvel era, but there is certainly real gems within that run, and so this slide was to call out just a few favorites from that. So issue 189 with the Robo Skull on the front cover was a two-parter only, featuring the introduction of the Red Shadows, the Robo Skull, the Black Major into the Real American Hero continuity, and it was a really nice short story set in the high seas, very nicely done. Similarly, issue 190 and 192, a two-parter story, again, sort of different feel to it than perhaps some of the other stories at that time with the Blue Ninjas and the Brave Wave Scanners and so on. Much more grounded. It's a G.I. Joe team out in the jungle. It's Major Blood, sort of very much in war criminal mode. There's a lot of very cool action, John Wick style vengeance. A great two-parter there. We've put on issue 200, which is a sort of culmination of a big sort of epic story, and I'll let you call that one out, Tim, because it's one of your favorites.
Yeah, it's got a good Duke Cobra Commander fight, and it's an oversized issue. I don't think it's technically a double-sized issue, but as Mark just said, it is a culmination. And if issue 100 and 150 didn't have the punch as double-sized anniversary issues that you remember issue 50 having, the Fall of Springfield, issue 200 is back in that direction. And also, a month or two later, I got a letter printed saying how much I liked issue 200. So everyone, that's how much I like issue 200. And we got it for sale at my store.
Actually, it's worth calling out.
We're out of a cover, but we've got the Hama sketch cover.
I see. And it's worth calling out that all three of these issues that we just called out so far are illustrated by S.L. Gallant, who essentially was a record-breaking penciler. He had a huge duration on the run on this book. I think the book got off to slightly shaky ground with the artist in the very first arc, Agustin Padilla, who didn't necessarily feel like such a good fit for the G.I. Joe story aesthetic. But S.L. Gallant's, he really did fit in. He sort of got the characters, he got the gear, he could tell he was great at the storytelling and great at hitting the deadlines. This book was coming out every single month, pretty much without delay, and being really I think having some quite stretching turnaround times for him as an artist to do that. So I think we were sort of spoilt by such a long run by a single artist who was doing such a solid job at telling these stories. And sort of it's almost without compare in modern comics that you have such long runs from a single artist.
Yeah, in the Marvel run, the longest running artist was Rod Wiggum, and Gallant's run is 3 times as long, or 2.5 times as long. I always forget that S.L. Gallant, before taking over A Real American Hero, or a little bit at the beginning concurrently, drew one of the movie comics and also did some of the sort of Chuck Dixon verse, IDW verse comics. So, and then as you said, during this long run on A-Raw, hopped off to draw the $6 Million Man miniseries, not written by Larry Hama. So this guy's drawn like over 100 G.I. Joe comics.
And then I've highlighted issue 246, which is the first issue from artist Nitho Diaz, which is also the first part of Dawn of the Arashikage, which was this storyline focusing in on Dawn, the new female Snake Eyes character, although it definitely more than just a female version of Snake Eyes, but you have to read the stories to kind of get that nuance. And it was a real sort of kinetic shot into the run with this change of artist, and Nitho Diaz has gone on to be picked by Marvel to be drawing a lot of their flagship titles now. So he's gone on to big things. And then I've also called out on screen issue 278, which is an Untold Tales story. It's got Snowjob on the front cover. It's illustrated by Dan Schoening, who also did the Saturday Morning Adventures. But really, I could have called out any number of titles there. I think the final stretch of G.I. Joe up to issue 300 was really strong. I think there was the Snake Hunt. I think it was 12. Was it 12 parts? There was a
Snake on its 10 chapters.
So there was
266 to 275.
Yep. So there was that big sort of maxi storyline, Snake Hunt, and then after that there was a number of like Untold Tales, sort of one and done stories. A lot of artists just maybe doing one particular issue. And there was a lot of, very solid and exciting stories from all of these different artists during that phase. Before then, the final 10 issues leading up to 300, which again, a maxi story focusing in on Cobra Casino and Cobra Island, which led to the resurrection of the Lone Snake Eyes that is then sort of established for the, in the Skybound continuity, and they pick up the same storyline. So, I've got a big soft spot for the IDW A-Ra era. It's slightly harder to come by, as we say. There has been collections apart from the last few issues, which didn't see print in as a trade paperback, and because the print runs were quite a lot smaller, some of the single issues can be harder to come by at cheapo prices, let's say. So that leads us to Skybound getting the G.I. Joe comics license. So after a period away where we didn't have our monthly dose of G.I. Joe comics, from 2023 through to now, Skybound, as a sort of that sub house under the Image publisher umbrella, have been publishing the books. So in terms of the Hama-verse, they picked up directly where IDW had left off with issue 300, by launching with issue 301, making G.I. Joe a real American hero one of the easiest continuities to follow. You start with issue 1 and you continue through to 300 and then continue through from 301. It makes it much easier to follow than, for example, the somewhat spaghetti nature of the IDW universe books.
Or a comic book published by Marvel called The Amazing Spider-Man, which every 2 years relaunches at issue number 1. And then like a year or two later, when it gets up to an anniversary issue, like 600 or 650 or 700, will revert to the old numbering, but then needs to jump back to the lower numbering, but then needs to relaunch because there'll be a movie.
Indeed. And don't get me started on the trade paperback collecting either. So then in this Skybound publishing era, we've had some ARA, a Real American Hero branded books, which were not written by Larry Hama. So they've not been they're pretty much standalone. So you can have them as part of that same world or not. And because they're not really necessary referencing continuity in either direction, that Hama's not referencing events of these one shots, and they're not necessarily requiring too much knowledge of the main book to follow them. You can treat them as one shot sort of standalone books. And so these came out in April 2025 this year. 5 one-shots plus a reprint of the original Silent Mission, issue 21, all each one done by a different writer and art team.
And after we record and post this episode, there will be a softcover collection of these 5 one-shots and the original issue 21 with a new cover, which was used as a variant cover for the reprint of issue 21 back in April 2025. Another way to think about these 5 Silent Missions issues, they are definitely not in the Energon universe. If you're wondering what continuity they're in, and you can't quite put them in the Larry Hama, A Real American Hero continuity, and I do, there are definitely no alien robots walking around in the background talking about Energon. Another way to think of them is if the 5 or 6 issues during the Marvel run, written by Stephen Grant and Peter Quinones and 1 or 2 other names, the 5 or 6 issues not written by Larry Hama, if you don't count those in your personal A Real American Hero Hama canon, then don't count these. If you do, I think of these as sort of 5 fill-in issues that weren't published as numbered issues that sort of, finger quotes, ruined, an unbroken Larry Hama streak at Skybound. And one more way to look at it is I always want more G.I. Joe stories. As we perhaps demonstrated with the IDW publishing span, there can be too many, or there can be so many different ones, it can get hard to track. And so if you're going to do another one or a different one, it's got to be really different. It's got to have a really good reason for existing. And the hook of these, wordless issues, no dialogue, no captions, no sound effects, by interesting creators that hadn't done G.I. Joe, even though they're not Larry Hama, was a cool one. And if you want to learn more about those, we did 5 episodes of Talking Joe about these. Plus, we interviewed some of these people.
Yeah. And Phil Hester, who created the Beachhead one-shot, he has just been announced as a guest at Assembly Required, the G.I. Joe convention in Iowa later on this year.
All right, so you're describing the November 2025. I'm just assuming that this episode is going to be such an evergreen guide for people that they'll be watching this and listening to this years into the future. So let's just be specific. Phil Hester, scheduled to be at Assembly Required November 2025.
Do you remember November 2025, guys?
Also me, Tim Finn, scheduled to attend assembly required, November 2025. If you see a guy walking around with red glasses and a beard, it's probably me. A bald white guy with red glasses and a beard. For those of you listening and not watching.
Cool. So getting past the Hama-verse to the meat and potatoes of this new Skybound universe. In 2023, they launched what they're calling the Energon Universe from showrunner Robert Kirkman, with the surprise launch of Void Rivals in fall 2023, which, as a page turn surprise, featured a giant transforming robot, Jetfire, in the pages, and that was the starting pistol for this Energon universe being launched from Skybound. Hot on the heels of that, we had Transformers from creator Daniel Warren Johnson in October 2023, and the announcement of
Before you go to the next slide, Void Rivals, ongoing monthly series. Transformers, ongoing monthly series. Okay, sorry. Please continue, Mark.
So yes, and the announcement of two initial G.I. Joe miniseries, with a further two to be announced at that point in time. Duke in December 2023, Cobra Commander January 2024. And yes, call out as well that this is one combined universe, and sort of, while there is very much an approach to these books that you can just read any book in isolation, you don't have to buy one to understand what's going on in the others. If you're reading everything, there is sort of touch points between them, and it makes for a more fulfilling joined up read. So
do you have a pages slide? Do you have a Duke and Cobra Commander slide?
I do have a Duke and Cobra Commander slide, yeah.
Okay.
So
I thought you wanted to get to that one by now.
I was just going to say that while talking about Void Rivals and Transformers specifically, that in the pages of Void Rivals, the storyline around Cobra La that gets introduced originally in Cobra Commander continues on in the pages of Void Rivals, with Pythona playing quite a big part of that. And in the pages of Transformers, there's also little bits of G.I. Joe that occur there. So Transformers issue 2 very much is a prologue to the Duke miniseries in terms of the events that occur there, sort of as a launch pad to the Duke series. And then subsequent to that, we've also seen a number of G.I. Joe characters turning up in the pages of Transformers, most notably the character of Doc. But moving in proper to the G.I. Joe Energon universe, that was launched with these two miniseries, Duke and Cobra Commander, both written by Joshua Williamson, who's very much the brains behind G.I. Joe in the Skybound Energon universe. And these artist teams, Tom Riley, Geordie Belair, and that's on Duke, and in Cobra Commander, Andrea Milana and Annalisa Leone on colours. And then after those books have been out, we got two more titles, not written by Joshua Williamson, but I think very much developed in collaboration with him. So Scarlet and Destro. So those all of these series came out as five-part miniseries coming out monthly. They then received a trade paperback collecting all of those issues into the relevant trade paperback titles, like Duke Volume 1, Scarlet Volume 1, and so on. And now we have also seen these being published as, how are they? It's codename G.I. Joe hardback editions. So Volume 1 collecting Duke and Cobra Commander, and Volume 2 collecting Scarlet and Destro. I don't think Volume 2 is quite out yet.
Correct. But it's in the catalogs. Your comic book store can order it.
So after these miniseries introduced us to the main characters, we then saw the launch of G.I. Joe issue number 1 from the same creative team that brought us Duke. Which sort of, as now the ongoing, and as at the time of recording, which is September 2025, we are 10 issues into that, and by all accounts, the team is all is prepping to go all the way through to 100 and beyond, if they can be believed.
One of the great things about Skybound's approach, both to the Larry Hama title and also the Energon Universe, is not too many books and really talented artists and color artists and consistency. So it's a little confusing at the beginning of the Energon Universe that there are these 4 miniseries, and it does help if you read them in a certain order. And none of them say G.I. Joe. So if you're looking for the hot new G.I. Joe comic, a comic called Duke by itself, it's like there was a Prowler miniseries a couple years ago that Marvel published, and it wasn't Amazing Spider-Man presents the Prowler. It was Prowler. Maybe it wasn't a mini. Maybe it was an ongoing that got cut short. Anyway, except this launch, which had 2 miniseries running at the same time, and then 2 more miniseries running at the same time. Right now, there's just this one G.I. Joe Energon Universe monthly, and in the larger Energon Universe, there's just that one Void Rivals book and that one Transformers book. We are 2 years in, and Skybound has not overloaded shops or readers' wallets. And people in the letters pages might still be saying, oh, how about a special? How about another series? And the reply is often, we're keeping it small and focused so we can keep the quality up. And similarly, the guy who drew that Duke miniseries draws the 1st and 3rd arcs of the monthly G.I. Joe. And the guy who drew the Cobra Commander miniseries draws the 2nd arc of G.I. Joe. So there's a sense that even though there's a bunch of different titles and a bunch of different creative teams, it's not spread out and stretched. It's quite focused. And then similarly, over in Larry Hamaville, since A Real American Hero came back with issue 301, it had a new artist, new to G.I. Joe anyway, in the form of Chris Mooneyham. And then several issues in, when he needed a break to catch up with the schedule, the editor brings in very talented Paul Pelletier, who's drawn Green Lantern and Flash and Aquaman and was it Negation for CrossGen? And some the cosmic stuff at Marvel. Been drawing comics for 25 years, and now they seem to be taking turns. One of them draws a couple issues, the other draws a couple issues, or maybe 5 or 6. And so both of these 2 takes on G.I. Joe at Skybound are small and focused and have a lot of artistic consistency. And I think G.I. Joe readers have said and sort of demonstrated over and over, they want quality and consistency.
Very good. So I think that is pretty much our guide to the history of G.I. Joe publishing from 1981 or so through to present day, whichever present day is for you, dear listener, viewing this in the future.
Now, we didn't cover everything. We didn't mention Tales of G.I. Joe or G.I. Joe Digest. Those were reprint books at Marvel in the late 80s. But if your friend has 2 hours to kill and really wants to know almost everything about G.I. Joe, what to read and maybe in what order, send them a link to listen to or watch this.
Yeah, and speaking of which, you can find us at talkingjoe.co.uk. That is the website that links to all of the places we can be found. We're on Twitter, Instagram. We've got a Facebook group where you can get involved, see the latest news as it is posted, and sort of, add in your little discussions or things that you found there. We're also on Patreon, patreon.com/talkingjoe. So a big thanks to Richard, Sam, Bill, Justin, Rob, Shane, Simon, Chris, Joe, Craig, Frank, Mike, D, Shane V2. This version of Shane was relaunched 6 6 years after the original, and now has since been disavowed. Plus, Infinite Entertainment, Patrick and Gary V. They are all getting early access to episodes like this one, as well as other exclusive contents and all sorts of fun, as this jingle explains.
Nothing beats the Talking Joe podcast, and right now, Patreon members are getting early access to episodes and extra content. Listen now with Talking Joe, a podcast you can trust.
Speaking of destinations to go on the internet where you can find impactful information that you can definitely trust, where can you be found, Tim?
My creative partners and I have a YouTube channel, which is YouTube, at Atomic Abe, which is video essays, carefully researched video essays on television and film. They're funny and, dare I say, smart. I'm very proud of them. I own a comic book store, a brick and mortar comic book store in Somerville, Massachusetts. That borders, Somerville borders Cambridge and Medford and Boston. That's Hub Comics. And I write about G.I. Joe at my blog, realamericanbook.com, which is the internet outpost of a history book on G.I. Joe that I've been writing for 25 years, and I'm finishing this year.
And for all of those listeners, because this is an evergreen episode all about G.I. Joe that you can delve into at any given time, all of those listeners in the future, I hope you have been enjoying Tim's book that is definitely out and a great success at this point in time in the future. Right. And while we're speaking about your endeavors, Tim, Hub Comics, your comic book shop in Somerville near Boston, I guess you have a nice curated selection of G.I. Joe comics, both from present day, but also in your back issue bins. Yes,
Because I'm a G.I. Joe fan and expert, we have 1/8 of our back issues. We don't have a big back issue selection because we're really a graphic novel store, but we do have some back issues, and 1/8 of it is G.I. Joe. And all of the soft covers that are in print, we have a bunch of previous ones that are not in print anymore. Get them while you can. And we have all of the current issues. That's the Hama stuff. That's the Energon Universe. I'm also a Transformers fan. I've become a Void Rivals fan. And if I'm at the shop and you have questions about G.I. Joe, do ask me.
Very good.
Sometimes if I'm not there and you ask one of my employees, they'll text me. And I'll call the store. And I'll call the store if I'm not too busy.
Very good. So that is done with this special delving into the history and publication order of G.I. Joe. Next time, doubtless, we will either be talking to a fascinating comic creator in one of our legendary interviews, or just talking about one of the latest issues as it hits the stands. So I think with all of that said, Tim, is there anything that you need to remind the listeners to take away with them?
I do. It's that Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
Laters!